It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. Adding fuel to the fire of the war in Ukraine. After America decides to allow its missiles to be used inside the country, Russia's warning of a new round of tension. Tonight, the European government's warning that President Putin's war may not be the only security threat after the apparent cutting of an undersea cable below the Baltic. As Sir Keir Starmer meets the leader, whose partnership with Russia was said to have no limits, the Prime Minister says he is doubling down on support for Ukraine. Also tonight, ploughing their way to Parliament, we meet the farmers turned protesters as the government insists its budget tax changes won't have a widespread impact. The Sky News investigation that led to a change in policy over police strip searches, but we hear why there are still questions to answer. The whole in the hopes for better social housing as we see the reality of life in one council tower block. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's coming up in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Hello there, good evening. The official Russian reaction had appeared less belligerent than many might have feared. After President Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to carry out limited attacks inside the country using American missiles, the Kremlin noted it had not been an official announcement, but would add fuel to the fire. Tonight, though, the governments in Germany and Finland have warned of the threat of hybrid warfare by malicious actors after the suspicious severing of an undersea communications cable between the two countries. This as the leaders of many of the world's largest economies meet at the G20 summit. We'll hear from there in a moment and also have more on the alleged events under the Baltic Sea. But first, from Kyiv, our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, has this report.
Russian armoured vehicles heading towards Ukraine positions, firing as they go, but also being engaged. These are some of the latest pictures from the front line in Kursk, the Russian region invaded by Ukraine in the summer. Soldiers who gave Sky News this material say they're facing more and more of these attacks. This vehicle was destroyed, but they say it's non-stop. In the skies as well, it's relentless. Russian drones and missiles tracked and shot at by air defence teams every night with varying levels of success. Long-range missiles would allow Ukraine to attack the places where these missiles come from. Ukrainian politicians like Lysia Vasilenko applaud President Biden's decision, but say it should go further.
It's an almost historic decision. Having a permission to strike inside of all of Russia would really change things around for the people of Ukraine first and foremost, but also on the battlefield. However, as things stand now, we have only limited permission to strike.
Do you think it'll change?
We certainly will work towards it changing.
The Russian offensive is now augmented by 10,000 North Korean soldiers. It's at the root of President Biden's change of heart. Russia is furious, claiming it's an escalation of the war.
It is obvious that the outgoing administration in Washington intends to take steps, and they have been talking about this, to continue adding fuel to the fire and provoking further escalation of tensions of this conflict.
President Zelensky, visiting frontline troops in the east of the country, has not been drawn on the subject of the change in use for long-range weapons, only saying that missiles will do the talking.
Well, there's long been a feeling amongst the civilian population as well as the military that Western countries, and in particular the United States, have only ever given them enough weapons to hold the ground against Russia, not to take the fight to them. They believe that basically the West is scared of Russia. Well, they're hoping now with this new permission to fire long-range missiles, things may have changed.
Deadly missile strikes on Ukraine continue. A residential building in Odessa was struck in the afternoon. Emergency services say a number of people were killed or injured in the attack, both inside and outside the building. It comes after a wave of drone and missile attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure that has caused widespread power cuts, a Russian tactic throughout this war. In Kyiv's Maidan Square, flags commemorating the fallen flutter in the winter wind. 1,000 days since the Russian invasion began, civilians and soldiers alike are still dying. But Ukraine is still fighting. 1,000 days ago, few thought that was likely. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Kyiv.
Well, the missile system which Ukraine can now use in a limited way inside Russia can be deployed either to deliver a single high explosive or many smaller cluster ones. That means the weapons could pose a risk to the North Korean troops whose deployment America has suggested has triggered the permission to use the missiles. Our international correspondent, Alex Rossi, has this assessment of where the targets could be.
After months of pleas from the Ukrainians, America has finally allowed Ukraine to use US missiles to strike deep inside Russian territory. So is this the game changer that could turn the tide in Kyiv's favour? The Americans had already provided Ukraine with the MGM-140 Army tactical missile system, but there were limitations on its use. Known as ATACMS, they're long-range ballistic missiles that can strike targets 186 miles away with a warhead that can hold about 375 pounds of explosives. ATACMS can have two types of warhead, a single high-explosive variant, as well as a warhead that can carry cluster munitions. Ukraine has said they could be used to stop or slow down troop movements or destroy Russian air or military bases, which would help Ukraine in the defence of its own territory. And this map shows how far the missiles could reach inside Russia and the potential targets. They include airfields, ammunition warehouses, radars and missile bases. Now, on the face of it, it's a big military edge, but the Russians are already responding by moving hardware and personnel out of range. The Biden administration has made clear it's the presence of North Korean troops here in the Kursk region that pushed them to change their minds on the use of ATACMS. It means the Ukrainian army can now use them to repel Russia's anticipated counteroffensive in Kursk. Ukraine captured this territory in August and is now attempting to defend it. President Biden's decision will likely see the British government follow suit, allowing the use of its Storm Shadow missiles. Storm Shadow has a shorter range, about 155 miles, and it's launched from an aircraft. But the Russians are furious, seeing this latest development as a major provocation as it crosses some of Putin's red lines. They've not made clear how they'll respond, but a response is coming. It could take the form of support for the West's enemies or even a cyber attack on its interests.
The Russians are plainly very angry. There are things they could do. They could, for example, supply missiles to the Houthis to use against Western tankers in the Red Sea. I think they're likely to be quite constrained because they are looking forward to Trump's arrival in the anticipation that Trump will put pressure on Ukraine towards doing some sort of a deal. And they won't want to take any actions which complicate the likelihood of that.
Allowing long-range weapons to be used deep inside Russia is a major development. It will certainly be a boost for Ukraine's morale at a time when it's losing ground in the Donbass. But it's unlikely to change the trajectory of the war in isolation. The deep strikes will, though, be a complication for Moscow. It will make it more difficult for President Putin to present the war as an overwhelming success, especially if Russian military assets start blowing up well inside its territory.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer said today that he arrived at the G20 summit with one message: to double down on support for Ukraine. He wouldn't be drawn, though, on whether the Ukrainians would be allowed to fire British Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. His first meeting was with a leader, China's President Xi, who has previously promised a partnership with no limits to Russia's leader. Our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes reports now from Rio de Janeiro.
Keir Starmer staying quiet on whether Ukraine can fire British missiles inside Russia. Instead, using a meeting of world powers in Brazil to speak out loudly against Moscow's invasion.
We must double down on our support for Ukraine. Tomorrow is day 1,000 of the conflict. That's 1,000 days of aggression from Russia. And 1,000 days of sacrifice from Ukraine. We need to make sure Ukraine has what is necessary for as long as necessary, because we cannot allow Putin to win this war.
Even if the green light is given for Ukraine to use British Storm Shadow cruise missiles inside Russia, it's unlikely the UK will confirm anything until they've actually been launched. Yet with the US finally giving permission to Ukrainian forces to unleash American long-range missiles on Russian soil, the impact of the war is overshadowing this G20 summit. Interactions at the gathering of the world's biggest economies reflect how the balance of global power is shifting, with China on the rise, Russia still in the room, and Western influence waning.
Ukraine. The United States strongly supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Everyone around this table, in my view, should as well.
Joe Biden remains a powerful figure, but with far less clout in the final days of his presidency. Against this backdrop, Britain's Prime Minister met China's president at the summit. A delicate balancing act, pitching security concerns against economic desires.
As permanent members of the UN Security Council and major global economies, China and the UK share a dual responsibility of advancing our respective national development and addressing global challenges.
We want our relations to be consistent, durable, respectful, as we have agreed. Avoid surprises where possible, and strengthened dialogue should provide stronger understanding.
Yet the leaders here know these are unstable times, and they're about to get even more unpredictable with Donald Trump's imminent return to the world stage. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Brazil.
Well, our political editor, Beth Rigby, is at the G20 summit in Rio. I'll speak to you, Beth, in a moment. But first to our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, and our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Ivor, the reaction in Russia today to America's decision, very angry, and they're being effectively accused tonight by the Finnish and German governments of hybrid warfare. What has actually happened?
Well, first of all, Anna, on America's decision, as you say, Russia's reaction has been furious, very much what we've come to expect. The Kremlin accused the US of ratcheting up tensions and escalating the conflict. Now, you might think that's a bit rich coming from Russia, given the reports of thousands of North Korean troops being sent by Moscow to the front line to aid its forces there. But there was no mention of that. Russia always insists its actions are reciprocal. So what could its actions and response be this time? In the past, Vladimir Putin has threatened to arm the West's enemies when this topic has been brought up. If this kind of permission is given to Ukraine, he's also frequently referred to the nuclear option. But in general, the threats are quite vague and undefined. And the sense clearly in Washington is that this is a bluff from Moscow, another one, because they have made these kind of public threats before during this conflict and not followed through on them. I think there is still a concern, though, that Moscow could respond in other ways, more subtle ways that it doesn't want to broadcast, things like cyber attacks, sabotage or hybrid warfare, as the Finnish and German governments put it tonight. That's after a Baltic Sea communications cable was severed. Moscow wasn't blamed directly, but Russia was referred to by Finland and Germany in the same sentence as malicious actors. And Europe has, of course, accused Moscow of this kind of behaviour before. So I think what will worry the West is not the public fury coming from the Kremlin. Instead, it's what might happen under the radar and out of sight.
And Mark, criticism of the Biden administration's decision from those around Donald Trump. But why has Joe Biden acted now?
I think a number of reasons. First of all, North Korea, as Ivor mentioned, the fact that 10,000 North Korean soldiers are now on the ground, boots on the ground, helping the Russians, kind of changes things significantly from an American perspective. It makes the whole thing feel a lot more global. That was the game changer, so they would argue here in Washington. Why now, in terms of giving the permission to use these weapons? Well, I think North Korea, that is one thing. Trump is another, and there are two dimensions to the Trump angle, I think. First of all, I think President Biden has calculated that where it would have been a risk before to have sent these weapons to Ukraine to be used by Ukraine because you don't quite know what Putin might do, I think now the White House believes that given they know Trump is coming and Trump may have some sort of a capitulation to the Russians, something that the Russians would like, Russia is less likely to respond to this apparent escalation by the American side. So I think those two things are together why this decision has come now. There is another very interesting thing that's gone on tonight, though, and I think that's the language that we're hearing up in New York. We've heard the Ukrainian foreign minister is in New York alongside David Lammy, who's chairing the UN Security Council this month. And the Ukrainian foreign minister has echoed the language of Donald Trump, talking about Ukraine needing to be in a position of peace through strength. David Lammy used the same language as well. They are looking beyond President Biden. They are appealing subtly to President Trump and saying, look, you are talking all the time about peace through strength. Well, we need strength. We need peace through strength in Ukraine because, as Lammy said tonight, Vladimir Putin only ever responds to strength. So an interesting turn of phrase there, parroting the language of Donald Trump because they want him, they need him. If you're Ukraine, they need him on their side.
Well, to Ria now, and Beth, Sir Keir Starmer told you that he was going to the G20 with one message: to back support for Ukraine. But how much is the war and indeed the missile decision playing out there?
Well, Anna, it's a curious thing, really, because it's all anyone is talking about here on the sidelines. But when you try and get a world leader onto camera, such as I did with the Prime Minister today, to talk about the use of long-range missiles, they simply will not discuss it. And there was some frustration, I have to say, when we were quizzing the Prime Minister's spokesperson about this earlier today, because we knew back when he met with fellow leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in September in New York, this was being actively discussed. But now it is just radio silence. So when I asked him about it today, about whether or not Biden was giving him the green light for those Storm Shadow long-range missiles, he simply said to me he wouldn't comment. He's not going to get into operational details because the only winner, he said, is if I were to do that, is Putin. But look, we are on the eve of the 1,000th day of this war, and it seems that from the West's point of view, in terms of the Allies, there is this escalation. Prime Minister Starmer, too, has talked about the North Korean troops, and it seems like there could be movement on these missiles. While no one wants to talk about it publicly, this is, of course, what is going on behind the scenes. The Prime Minister came here saying it was his number one issue. He says that he wants to double down and shore up Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I think what we might see coming out of this summit is an attempt by some allies to Trump-proof the fight in Ukraine before a more ambivalent, if you like, president comes in January. So watch this space.
Beth, Ivor and Mark, thanks to all of you. Well, Sir Keir Starmer indicated today that he won't be backing down over inheritance tax changes for farmers. The Prime Minister said the vast majority wouldn't be hit and that the government is investing £5 billion in the farming industry. Thousands of farmers are expected to descend on Westminster tomorrow to protest the changes. Our West of England correspondent, Dan Whitehead, spoke to one of them.
Come on, then. Come on.
Cattle here have been looked after by Will's family since 1939.
Come on!
One day he hopes to hand the 500-acre farm in South Gloucestershire down to his son. But the government's new inheritance tax plans could make that difficult.
We've probably buried our head in the sand a little bit about it. I think, back of a fag packet, rough estimates, tax is going to be north of £500,000.
Will would get 10 years to pay that bill.
Let's say that's £50,000 a year. You got that spare?
It's more than our profit in any year that we've had in the last 10 years. Dad's saying, are we going to have to sell something? It's worrying. It's worrying. It's an additional worry that we didn't need.
Will is one of thousands of farmers descending on London, angry at the government's proposals to charge 20% inheritance tax on farms over £1 million. For farmers like Will and thousands of others, this isn't just about a huge new tax bill. Many see it as yet another stumbling block to getting the next generation of farmers to take over in an industry that already feels like it's under attack. This isn't the first protest farmers have held this year. Hundreds rolled into Westminster back in March, angry at cheap imports. The National Farmers Union will gather 1,800 members to lobby MPs, but such is the level of frustration, many more are expected to protest on the streets.
We in the NFU, we have a detailed job to do, which is to explain to government why this is wrong, not just for farming, not just for the countryside, but not just for our families, but for the economy in general. This is a bad tax and it's been badly implemented because it will affect growth and productivity in the country.
The government says only the wealthiest of estates will be impacted, with 72% of farms unaffected, a calculation the union says is wrong.
And so fourth generation, wow.
Yeah, I know. I signed up to it in blood.
It's why farmers like Will are leaving the countryside for the city to demand the government thinks again. Dan Whitehead, Sky News in South Gloucestershire.
Yeah.
Well, we heard earlier from the Prime Minister about support for Ukraine. Here's now what he had to say at the G20 summit about the disquiet over farmers' inheritance tax closer to home.
Look, I do understand that it's causing concern, but if you take a typical case of a couple wanting to pass a family farm down to one of their children, which would be a very typical example, with all of the thresholds in place, that's £3 million before any inheritance tax is paid. And that's why I'm confident that the vast majority of farms and farmers will not be affected at all by that aspect of the budget. They will be affected by the £5 billion that we're putting into farming, and I'm very happy to work with farmers on that.
Well, our chief political correspondent John Craig is in Westminster tonight. John, it seems we're at the stage where nothing the government says will pacify the farmers.
Well, the only thing that would, of course, would be a complete climb down, a U-turn on this very controversial policy. Around here, well, if previous farmers' demonstrations are anything to go by, this area just opposite Parliament will be packed with farmers. Let's wait and see if they bring their tractors. I can recall previous demonstrations when the road here has been full of enormous tractors. There's a lobby of Parliament, a few thousand probably attending that. There's talk of a rally up in Whitehall by the gates of Downing Street as well. It's going to be a huge demonstration, and we've already heard about the sort of anger amongst many farmers. Jeremy Clarkson is due to join the farmers. The Conservative Party, including their leader Kemi Badenoch, are backing them as well, and the government will come under a huge assault from the farming community and opposition politicians. Mr. Clarkson, sources are pointing out, said in the Times in 2021 that avoiding inheritance tax was a critical factor when he bought his agricultural land. Well, tonight there's been a meeting between Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, and Tom Bradshaw. He's the president of the National Farmers Union, the NFU. Well, didn't go well. Mr. Bradshaw said that there were tough conversations had at that meeting. The two sides are still a long way apart, no closer together. And tomorrow at the rally, Mr. Bradshaw is going to say that it's the straw that broke the camel's back. It's a betrayal and a kick in the teeth for farmers.
John, in Westminster, thank you. Full coverage, of course, tomorrow. Now, Greater Manchester Police says it has made wide-ranging changes to its treatment of women in custody following an investigation by Sky News. Strip searches for what are called welfare issues have been banned, and they're now a last resort for other purposes. Those recommendations were made over the summer in a report by the former Victims Commissioner, but there is still evidence not all is right. One victim of domestic violence, whose case was featured in the Baird report, has told Sky News her treatment was subsequently described as acceptable by the Police Complaints Department. She spoke to our Home Editor, Jason Farrell.
Sophie was in an abusive relationship.
He punched me,
put his hands around my throat, thumbs in my eyes, and wouldn't let me leave the house. I just thought I'm probably going to end up in a grave at some point.
After this incident, she reported her partner and he was arrested and charged. But 6 weeks later, the police turn up at Sophie's door at 3 a.m. She's taken to this police station and left in a cell for 11 hours. Why? Because her abusive partner made counter-allegations, accusing her of breaking the wing mirror on his car and hurting his arm at a time when he'd strangled her.
They knew what I'd gone through. They knew what I was trying to protect myself from. I was in regular contact with domestic violence support workers who were meeting with police liaison. They knew that I'd had the locks changed. They knew I had an alert on the house and my phone.
Sophie's case became part of a review published in July this year into the practices of Greater Manchester Police, which found the reasons for her arrest were unreasonable.
One of them was that she had bruised his arms on the day when he tried to strangle her. And I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if someone tried to strangle me, I'd probably bruise his arms as well.
Dame Vera said the arrest was unlawful, and the Chief Constable had this reaction to the case.
I'm appalled by it. I am a professional police officer, and I am surrounded by thousands of good police officers who will simply and similarly be appalled.
There were a lot of people involved in that arrest, and they all got it wrong.
Indeed. It's a systemic failure, a leadership failure, a process failure.
The Baird inquiry was prompted by a Sky News investigation into the treatment of women in custody, which showed officers abusing their powers, including unlawful arrests and strip searches. Today, an update from the Mayor's office says GMP has ended so-called welfare strip searches, and an independent scrutiny panel will look at arrests and custody records, and an independent custody visitor will make unannounced visits.
There is significant progress, particularly the ending of strip searches. That is a big deal. And I would like to see that implemented across England and Wales.
But questions remain. After the Baird review was published, Sophie made a formal complaint about her treatment, but GMP's complaint system told her the service provided by the police was acceptable. Only when she told them she was part of the Baird inquiry did they reverse this.
That is why I am so pleased that Andy Burnham is going to have a scrutiny panel to look and see how complaints are being done now. Have we made a change? Was this the old regime? And now we can look forward to some sunny uplands.
GMP told us complaints, including Sophie's, are subject to a fair and thorough examination by professional standards, and where there's a case to answer, officers will face disciplinary proceedings. But Sophie's one of several complainants we've spoken to who say the police still don't recognise their own failings.
I wouldn't just be OK with reporting something now. I would look at the consequences of me doing that and what could happen to me as a result of that and how they might treat me.
No officer has been disciplined yet as a result of the Baird inquiry. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
A politician and a close protection guard are among 5 people facing possible prosecution over alleged betting ahead of the general election. Sky News has learned that the Gambling Commission is seeking to prosecute them following its investigation into bets placed ahead of Rishi Sunak's announcement of the date of July's election. Now, Labour promised in its election manifesto to build more social housing and protect the homes that already exist. The scale of that challenge, though, is clear in one tower block in East London. Residents showed us the leaks, mould and faulty lifts they face each day and say they've begged the local council to fix the problems. Our social affairs correspondent Becky Johnson has more.
This is Waltham Forest in East London, a place with one of the longest waiting lists for council housing in the country. Thousands are desperate for a flat in blocks like these. But we've been inside and found a snapshot of Britain's housing crisis.
You don't want to touch the damp?
It's cold and mouldy in this flat. The damage has been caused by a persistent leak. It's been like this for 8 years.
That is the girls' room. At the bottom is all mouldy. So the paint has come off. We have been suffering. Every week we're sick. I have a 10-year-old that's got breathing problems.
For years, they've been begging the council to fix it. Life like this is all her daughters can remember.
They grow up watching this grow with them as well. Do you know how sad that is?
I can't breathe that much.